The summer heat was unbearable in London that Tuesday afternoon. Tourists crowded around Buckingham Palace, cameras clicking constantly as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the famous royal guards. Among the sea of visitors was Jake Morrison, a 23-year-old college student from Ohio, who had saved up for 2 years to visit Europe. Jake had been walking around the palace grounds for over an hour, sweating through his cheap tourist t-shirt that read, "London or bust." His backpack felt heavier with each step, loaded with souvenirs he'd already bought from street vendors. The ice cream cart nearby caught his attention immediately. The vendor, an elderly man with kind eyes, was serving what looked like the most delicious vanilla soft serve Jake had seen in days. "That'll be £4.50, the vendor said cheerfully as he handed Jake the towering cone of creamy goodness. Jake paid eagerly, thinking this would be the perfect treat to cool him down while he continued his sightseeing adventure. The royal guard standing nearby was Sergeant William Hayes, a decorated soldier with 8 years of service. He stood perfectly still in his iconic red uniform and tall black hat, his face expressionless as hundreds of tourists took photos around him. William had trained for months to master the art of remaining motionless for hours, no matter what happened around him. Jake took his first lick of the ice cream and smiled with satisfaction. The cold sweetness was exactly what he needed. He pulled out his phone to take a selfie with the ice cream and the guard in the background. As he positioned himself for the perfect shot, he noticed how the guard never moved, not even an inch. "Wow, these guys are like statues," Jake thought to himself, impressed by the guard's discipline. He had read online about how royal guards were trained never to react to anything tourists did, no matter how silly or annoying. Some tourists tried to make them laugh. Others attempted to distract them, but the guards remained professional at all times. Jake finished taking his selfie and continued eating his ice cream while walking closer to observe the guard. The intricate details of the uniform fascinated him. The shiny buttons, the perfect creases, the way everything seemed so precise and official. He had never seen anything like this back home in Ohio. Other tourists gathered around, speaking in different languages, all equally amazed by the guard's stillness. Children pointed and whispered, adults took countless photos, and everyone seemed to respect the invisible boundary that kept them at a safe distance from the soldier. The ice cream was melting faster than Jake expected in the hot sun. Small drops began falling onto the pavement near his feet. He tried to eat it more quickly, but there was simply too much of it. The vendor had been generous with his serving, and now Jake was struggling to keep up with the melting pace. As he stood there, still mesmerized by the guard's perfect posture and unwavering focus, an idea began forming in Jake's mind. He had seen videos online of tourists trying different things to get reactions from royal guards. Most failed, but Jake wondered what it would take to get even the slightest response. The sun beat down mercilessly, and more ice cream dripped onto the ground. Jake moved slightly closer to the guard, still maintaining what he thought was a respectful distance. The sweet vanilla scent filled the air around them as other tourists continued their photo sessions. Little did Jake know that his innocent curiosity and the melting ice cream in his hand would soon lead to an incident that would change both his vacation and Sergeant Hayes's day in ways neither of them could have imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach Jake a valuable lesson about respect, consequences, and the serious nature of royal protocol. Jake's curiosity got the better of him as he watched Sergeant Hayes maintain his perfect stance. The ice cream continued melting rapidly in the intense heat, creating a sticky mess on his fingers. He wiped his free hand on his shorts, leaving a small vanilla stain, but his attention remained fixed on the motionless guard. "I wonder if he's even real," Jake muttered to himself. Stepping closer, a group of Japanese tourists had just finished taking photos and moved away, leaving Jake with a clearer view of the soldier. The guard's eyes stared straight ahead, never blinking, never acknowledging the chaos of tourists around him. The ice cream was now melting faster than Jake could consume it. Vanilla streams ran down his wrist and dripped onto his sneakers. He looked around for napkins but realized he had forgotten to ask the vendor for any. The nearest trash can was about 20 feet away, but Jake didn't want to lose his prime viewing spot near the guard. A middle-aged woman from Germany approached Jake, pointing at the guard and speaking broken English. "How long he stand there?" she asked, genuinely curious about the royal guard's duties. "I don't know," Jake replied, "but it's been at least 30 minutes since I got here, and he hasn't moved once. The woman nodded in amazement and continued taking pictures with her professional camera. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from his roommate back in Ohio. "Dude, you better be getting some crazy photos over there." This reminded Jake that he needed to document his London experience properly. His social media followers were expecting exciting content from his European adventure. He held up his melting ice cream and tried to position it for another photo with the guard in the background. As he adjusted his angle, a large glob of ice cream fell from the cone and splattered near the guard's polished black boots. Jake froze, expecting some kind of reaction, but Sergeant Hayes remained completely still. "Oh man," Jake whispered, looking at the white mess on the pristine pavement near the guard's feet. He glanced around to see if anyone had noticed, but the other tourists were busy with their own activities. The ice cream stain looked obvious against the clean stones, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. He knew he should clean it up, but he didn't have anything to wipe it with. The melting continued, and more drops threatened to fall from his cone. Jake made a quick decision to finish the ice cream as fast as possible, and then find something to clean up the mess. But as he took larger bites, trying to prevent further dripping, brain freeze hit him hard. The sudden pain made him gasp and step backward, bumping into a small child who was trying to get closer to the guard. The child's father gave Jake an annoyed look and moved his family to a different location. The brain freeze passed, but Jake was left with an even more precarious situation. The ice cream was now mostly liquid, barely held together by the cone. He realized he needed to dispose of it immediately before creating an even bigger mess. As he looked for the nearest waste bin, Jake noticed that a small crowd had gathered specifically to watch the Royal Guard. Some people were taking videos, others were posing for photos, and a few were simply standing in respectful silence, appreciating the tradition and discipline on display. Among the crowd was Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 70-year-old London resident who visited the palace grounds every Tuesday as part of her weekly routine. She had tremendous respect for the Royal Guards and often felt frustrated by tourists who didn't understand the significance of their duty. Mrs. Whitfield noticed the ice cream stain near the guards' feet and frowned disapprovingly. She looked around to identify who might be responsible for the mess. Her eyes settled on Jake, who was still holding the dripping cone and looking increasingly uncomfortable. The heat continued to beat down on everyone, making the situation worse. Jake's t-shirt was now soaked with sweat, and his face was red from both the sun and his growing embarrassment about the ice cream situation. He knew he needed to act quickly, but he was also fascinated by the guards' incredible self-control. What Jake didn't realize was that Sergeant Hayes was very much aware of everything happening around him, including the ice cream stain near his boots. The guard had been trained to notice every detail while maintaining his stoic appearance, and he was already mentally preparing for whatever might happen next. The situation was spiraling out of control faster than Jake could have imagined. His ice cream had transformed from a refreshing treat into a sticky disaster that threatened to embarrass him in front of dozens of international tourists. The cone was barely holding together, and vanilla ice cream continued streaming down his arm. Jake looked desperately toward the waste bin, but a large tour group had gathered between him and his escape route. The group leader was explaining the history of the Royal Guards in loud, enthusiastic tones, completely blocking Jake's path. He was trapped in his current position with a melting mess in his hands. Mrs. Whitfield continued watching Jake with growing disapproval. She had seen many disrespectful tourists over the years, but something about this young American's careless attitude particularly bothered her. The ice cream stain near the guard's feet was spreading slightly as the sun melted it further into the pavement. "Excuse me, young man," Mrs. Whitfield called out in her crisp British accent. Jake turned toward her voice, relieved that someone might help him with his predicament. "Are you responsible for that mess near the guard's feet?" Jake's face turned even redder. "Yes, ma'am, I'm really sorry. It was an accident. The ice cream is melting so fast in this heat, and I can't find anywhere to throw it away." He gestured helplessly with his free hand while trying to balance the dripping cone. "Well, you need to clean that up immediately," Mrs. Whitfield said firmly. "These guards deserve our utmost respect, and leaving a mess near their post is absolutely unacceptable." Her voice carried enough authority that several nearby tourists turned to see what was happening. Jake nodded frantically. "Of course, you're absolutely right. Do you happen to have a tissue or napkin I could use?" He was genuinely trying to be respectful, but his American casualness came across as flippant to the proper British woman. Mrs. Whitfield rummaged through her small purse but found only a single, tiny handkerchief that was clearly too precious to use on ice cream cleanup. "I'm afraid I don't have anything suitable," she said curtly. The tour group finally began moving away from the waste bin, but Jake's ice cream situation had reached a critical point. The cone was now completely soggy, and he could feel it about to collapse entirely in his hand. In a moment of panic, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his vacation. Instead of pushing through the crowd to reach the trash bin, Jake looked at the motionless royal guard and thought about all the videos he had seen online. He remembered reading that the guards were trained to ignore everything, no matter what tourists did around them. An incredibly poor idea formed in his heat-addled brain. If he's trained to ignore everything, Jake thought, then maybe I can just quickly wipe my hands on his uniform and clean up the mess. He won't react and it'll solve my problem. The logic seemed sound to his stressed mind, even though it was completely inappropriate. Sergeant Hayes, despite appearing completely motionless, was acutely aware of the young tourist's growing agitation. Through his peripheral vision, he had been monitoring Jake's increasingly desperate movements. The guard had dealt with thousands of tourists over his years of service, and he could sense when someone was about to do something foolish. The crowd around them had grown larger, with more people stopping to admire the guard's discipline and take photos. A family from Australia was posing nearby, their children asking questions about the guard's tall hat and red uniform. The festive atmosphere made Jake's impending mistake even more shocking. Jake took a step closer to Sergeant Hayes, his heart pounding with nervousness and the heat. The ice cream was now just seconds away from complete collapse. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he wrestled with his terrible decision. He knew it was wrong, but his panic was overriding his common sense. Mrs. Whitfield watched in horror as she realized what the young tourist was contemplating. "Don't you dare," she whispered urgently, but Jake was too focused on his melting crisis to hear her warning. The moment of truth had arrived. Jake raised his ice cream-covered hand toward the pristine red uniform of one of Britain's most respected royal guards, completely unaware that his next action would trigger consequences far beyond anything he could imagine. In one catastrophic moment that would be replayed in Jake's nightmares for months to come, he reached out and wiped his ice cream-covered hand directly across the front of Sergeant Hayes's immaculate red uniform. The white vanilla ice cream left a stark, obvious stain across the ceremonial fabric, creating a mess that was impossible to ignore. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Sergeant Hayes, who had remained motionless for over 2 hours, suddenly sprang into action with military precision that made Jake's blood run cold. The guard's eyes snapped toward Jake with an intensity that felt like laser beams cutting through his soul. "What do you think you're doing?" Sergeant Hayes bellowed in a voice that could have shattered glass. The boom of his military-trained voice echoed across the palace grounds, causing every tourist within 50 feet to freeze in shock. Children started crying. Adults gasped audibly and camera flashes went off like strobe lights as people documented the unprecedented scene. Jake stumbled backward, his face draining of all color as the magnitude of his mistake hit him like a freight train. The ice cream cone fell from his trembling hand and splattered across the pavement, adding to the mess he had already created. I'm sorry, I didn't mean," he stammered, but his words came out as incoherent babbling. Mrs. Whitfield covered her mouth in absolute horror. In all her 70 years of life, including her weekly visits to the palace grounds, she had never witnessed such blatant disrespect toward a royal guard. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, realizing they were witnessing something that would definitely go viral on social media. The guard took one precise step forward, his polished boots clicking against the pavement with military authority. Jake instinctively took 3 steps backward, nearly tripping over a small barrier rope. The ice cream stain on the guard's uniform was massive and obvious, a bright white smear across the pristine red fabric that represented centuries of British military tradition. "You have just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard," Sergeant Hayes announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, and Jake felt like he might faint from the combination of fear and embarrassment. "Do you understand the gravity of what you have done?" A crowd of at least 40 tourists had now gathered in a wide circle around the confrontation. Some were recording videos on their phones, others were taking photographs, and many were simply staring in stunned silence at the unfolding drama. Jake could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages as people tried to understand what had just happened. "Sir, I'm really, really sorry," Jake managed to squeak out, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "It was an accident. My ice cream was melting and I panicked. I didn't think." His explanation sounded pathetic even to his own ears, and he could see the disgust in the faces of everyone watching him. "You didn't think," Sergeant Hayes repeated, his voice dripping with controlled fury. "You came to one of Britain's most sacred ceremonial sites and decided to use a royal guard as your personal napkin. Is that correct?" The humiliation was overwhelming. Jake felt tears threatening to spill from his eyes as he realized that dozens of strangers were witnessing his complete and utter humiliation. His dream vacation to Europe was turning into the worst experience of his life, and it was entirely his own fault. A security officer in a bright yellow vest came running toward the commotion, speaking rapidly into his radio as he approached. "Control, we have a situation at Post 7. Tourist has made physical contact with the guard, requesting immediate backup and possible police response." Jake's heart sank even further as he heard the word police. What had started as a simple brain freeze from eating ice cream too quickly was now escalating into a potential legal situation that could ruin not just his vacation, but possibly his entire future. The Australian family that had been taking photos nearby quickly gathered their children and moved away from the scene, clearly wanting no part of the drama. Other tourists maintained their distance but continued watching and recording, creating a human amphitheater around Jake's public shaming. Sergeant Hayes maintained his position, the ice cream stain on his uniform serving as evidence of the most disrespectful act he had encountered in his 8 years of service. His training kicked in as he prepared for whatever protocol would be required to handle this unprecedented situation. Within minutes, 3 additional security officers arrived on the scene, followed closely by 2 Metropolitan Police constables who had been patrolling the palace grounds. The situation had escalated from a tourist's poor judgment to an official incident requiring formal documentation and potential legal consequences. "Right then, what's happened here?" asked Constable Margaret Thompson, a seasoned officer with 15 years of experience dealing with tourist incidents around Buckingham Palace. She looked at the ice cream stain on Sergeant Hayes's uniform, then at Jake's terrified face, and immediately understood the basic situation. Sergeant Hayes snapped to attention and delivered his report with military precision. "Constable, at approximately 14:30 hours, this individual deliberately smeared ice cream across my ceremonial uniform while I was on duty. The action was unprovoked and constitutes assault on a member of the Royal Guard." Jake's knees nearly buckled when he heard the word assault spoken by a police officer. "It wasn't assault," he protested desperately. "It was just ice cream. I was trying to clean my hands and I made a terrible mistake. Please, I'm just a tourist. I didn't know it was illegal." Constable Thompson pulled out her notebook and began taking down details. "What's your name and where are you from, sir?" she asked Jake in a tone that was professional but clearly indicated he was in serious trouble. "Jake Morrison from Columbus, Ohio," he replied, his voice shaking. "I'm here on vacation. I saved up for 2 years to come to Europe. Please don't arrest me. My parents will kill me if I end up in a British jail." His desperation was obvious to everyone watching, and some tourists began feeling sympathy for the young American who had made such a monumental error in judgment. Mrs. Whitfield stepped forward, her sense of propriety compelling her to get involved. "Officer, I witnessed the entire incident. This young man was struggling with a melting ice cream cone and had already made a mess near the guard's post. He appeared to panic and made an extremely poor decision. But I don't believe his intent was malicious. The crowd had grown to nearly 60 people, with tourists from around the world documenting what would certainly become an international incident." Jake could see phone cameras pointed at him from every direction, and he realized that his humiliation was being broadcast live to social media platforms worldwide. Constable Thompson continued gathering information while her partner, Constable James Fletcher, took photographs of the stained uniform as evidence. "Sir, under British law, any unwanted physical contact with another person can constitute assault regardless of intent. When that person is a member of the Royal Guard performing ceremonial duties, the matter becomes even more serious. Jake felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. The hot sun continued beating down on the gathering crowd, but he was shivering from fear and adrenaline. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll need to come with us to the station for questioning and formal processing," Constable Fletcher explained. "Depending on the circumstances and your cooperation, charges may or may not be filed. But make no mistake, this is a serious matter that will be thoroughly investigated." Sergeant Hayes, despite his anger at the disrespect shown to his uniform and position, began to feel a slight twinge of sympathy for the young tourist. He had seen enough scared people in his military career to recognize genuine remorse when he saw it. Jake wasn't a malicious troublemaker. He was just an immature young man who had made an incredibly stupid decision. The security officers began dispersing the crowd, asking tourists to move along and continue their visits. Many complied reluctantly, disappointed to miss the conclusion of the drama. Others lingered nearby, hoping to capture more footage of Jake's arrest. A senior palace official in an elegant suit arrived on the scene, having been summoned by radio when the incident was first reported. He surveyed the situation quickly, taking note of the stained uniform, the distressed tourist, and the growing media attention from phone cameras. "This is exactly the kind of incident we work to prevent," the official muttered to one of the security supervisors. "The uniform will need to be replaced immediately, and we'll need a full report for the palace administration. The press will certainly pick up on this story." Jake overheard the comment about media coverage and felt another wave of panic wash over him. Not only was he facing potential criminal charges in a foreign country, but his mistake was about to become international news. He imagined his family, friends, and professors back in Ohio seeing him on the internet as the stupid American who assaulted a royal guard with ice cream. As the police prepared to escort Jake away from the scene, he took one last look at Sergeant Hayes, who maintained his professional composure despite the vanilla stain across his ceremonial uniform. The guard's expression was unreadable, but Jake thought he detected a hint of disappointment rather than pure anger in the soldier's eyes. The police station interview room was small, sterile, and intimidating. Jake sat across from Constable Thompson, his hands still sticky with dried ice cream residue, while she completed the formal paperwork for his case. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, adding to the surreal atmosphere of his predicament. "Mr. Morrison," Constable Thompson began, "I've been dealing with tourist incidents for over a decade, and I can honestly say that what you did today ranks among the most disrespectful acts I've witnessed at the palace. Do you understand the cultural significance of what you've done?" Jake nodded miserably. "I'm starting to understand it now, but I swear I didn't think about any of that when it happened. I was just panicking about the melting ice cream, and I made the worst decision of my life. Is there any way I can apologize directly to the guard? Can I pay for the uniform cleaning or replacement?" The constable made notes as Jake spoke. "The ceremonial uniform will need to be completely replaced, not just cleaned. These aren't ordinary military uniforms. They're handcrafted pieces that cost several £1,000s each. The palace takes these matters very seriously because they involve both security protocols and centuries of tradition." Jake's heart sank even further. Several £1,000s meant several $1,000s. Money he absolutely didn't have as a college student who had already stretched his budget just to afford this European trip. "I don't have that kind of money," he admitted quietly. "Is there some kind of payment plan, or can I work it off somehow?" Meanwhile, back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Hayes was finally relieved from his post and taken to change out of his stained uniform. His replacement guard took position seamlessly, maintaining the continuous ceremonial presence that had been a tradition for centuries. In the guard quarters, Hayes examined the damage to his uniform in better light. The ice cream stain had spread during the hot afternoon, creating an even larger white smear across the red fabric. His fellow guards gathered around, some expressing anger at the tourists' disrespect, others sharing similar stories of inappropriate behavior they had witnessed. 8 years I've been doing this job," Hayes told his colleague, Corporal David Wright. "I've had people try to make me laugh, touch my uniform, even attempt to steal my hat. But I've never had someone actually use me as a napkin before. The audacity was incredible." Corporal Wright shook his head in sympathy. "What do you think will happen to the lad? He looked absolutely terrified when they took him away." Hayes considered this question carefully. Despite his initial anger, He had been thinking about Jake's obvious panic and immediate remorse. He's young and stupid, but I don't think he meant any real harm. Still, there have to be consequences. If we let tourists think they can touch us without repercussions, it could lead to much worse incidents. Back at the police station, Jake was allowed to make one phone call. With trembling fingers, he dialed his parents' number in Ohio, dreading the conversation he was about to have. The phone rang 4 times before his mother answered cheerfully. "Jake! How's London? Are you having a wonderful time?" His mother's excited voice made Jake feel even worse about what he had to tell her. "Mom," Jake began, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm in trouble. I'm at a police station, and I might be charged with assault." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "What do you mean, assault?" his mother finally asked, her voice shifting from excitement to panic. "Jake, what happened? Are you hurt? Did someone attack you?" "No, Mom, it's worse than that. I accidentally touched a royal guard with ice cream, and now they're saying I assaulted him. I might need to hire a lawyer, and I definitely have to pay for a new uniform that costs thousands of dollars." Jake could hear his mother explaining the situation to his father in the background, followed by several minutes of muffled conversation before she returned to the phone. "Your father and I are going to research lawyers in London immediately. Don't say anything else to the police until we can get you proper representation." After ending the call, Jake sat alone in the interview room, reflecting on how quickly his dream vacation had turned into a nightmare. Just that morning, he had been excited about seeing Big Ben and the Tower of London. Now he was facing potential criminal charges and international humiliation. Constable Thompson returned with a senior officer, Inspector Sarah Davies, who would be handling the case going forward. "Mr. Morrison," Inspector Davies said as she sat down, "we've been in contact with the palace officials, and they're willing to consider alternatives to formal charges, depending on your cooperation and willingness to make appropriate restitution." For the first time since the incident began, Jake felt a small glimmer of hope. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," he said earnestly. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to take full responsibility and learn from this mistake." 3 days later, Jake found himself back at Buckingham Palace, but this time under very different circumstances. Inspector Davies had arranged for a formal apology ceremony that would allow Jake to avoid criminal charges while still acknowledging the seriousness of his actions. The palace officials had agreed to this unusual arrangement after Jake's genuine remorse and willingness to make full restitution. Jake's parents had flown to London immediately, using their life savings to hire a solicitor and cover the costs of the incident. His mother, Patricia Morrison, was a soft-spoken teacher who had spent the flight crying over her son's predicament. His father, Robert Morrison, was a mechanic who worked double shifts to afford their modest lifestyle back in Ohio. "I can't believe we're here because our son wiped ice cream on a guard," Robert whispered to his wife as they waited in the palace's administrative office. 23 years old and still making decisions like a 5-year-old. The replacement uniform had cost $3,200, which translated to nearly $4,000, a devastating financial blow to the Morrison family. Jake had also agreed to perform 100 hours of community service with a London charity that supported veterans, ensuring his lesson would have lasting impact. Sergeant Hayes arrived at the administrative office in his dress uniform, looking every bit as imposing as he had during the original incident. Jake's stomach churned when he saw the guard, and he fought the urge to flee from the room. The weight of his actions felt heavier than ever. "Mr. Morrison," Sergeant Hayes said formally, "I understand you've requested the opportunity to apologize directly for your actions." Jake stood up on shaky legs, his carefully rehearsed apology suddenly forgotten in the face of the guard's intimidating presence. "Sergeant Hayes, I want to say how deeply sorry I am for what I did to you and your uniform. There's no excuse for my behavior, and I've learned more about respect and tradition in the past 3 days than I had in my entire life before this." The guard studied Jake's face, looking for signs of sincerity. What he saw was a young man who had been genuinely humbled by the consequences of his actions. "Mr. Morrison, the uniform you damaged has been worn by guards protecting the royal family for over a century. When you touched it inappropriately, you showed disrespect not just to me personally, but to every guard who came before me and everyone who will come after." Jake nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I understand that now, sir. I grew up thinking that everything was just for entertainment. But I've learned that some things are sacred and deserve respect, even if I don't fully understand their importance. Sergeant Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pin, the insignia worn by royal guards. This represents honor, duty, and service to something greater than ourselves. I'm giving this to you not as a souvenir, but as a reminder that every action has consequences, and respect must be earned through understanding. The ceremony concluded with Jake signing a formal agreement outlining his community service requirements and a commitment never to return to any royal property without explicit permission. As the family prepared to leave, Inspector Davies pulled Jake aside for a final conversation. "You've been given a second chance that most people in your situation would never receive," she told him seriously. "The palace officials were impressed by your immediate acceptance of responsibility and your family's efforts to make things right. Don't waste this opportunity." Jake's story didn't end there. Videos of the incident had indeed gone viral on social media, making him temporarily infamous as Ice Cream Tourist. However, the follow-up story of his formal apology and community service also gained attention, showing a different side of accountability and personal growth. When Jake returned to Ohio 6 weeks later, he had completed his community service and gained a new perspective on respect, tradition, and the importance of thinking before acting. He used his experience to speak at schools about cultural sensitivity and the consequences of poor decision-making. Sergeant Hayes continued his distinguished service with the Royal Guard, and the incident became a training story for new recruits about maintaining professionalism, even in the most unusual circumstances. The ice cream vendor who had unknowingly started the chain of events installed a napkin dispenser on his cart after hearing about the incident. Mrs. Whitfield, who had witnessed the entire ordeal, began volunteering as an informal cultural guide for confused tourists, helping them understand proper etiquette around the palace grounds. She often told Jake's story as an example of how quickly things can go wrong when respect is forgotten. Years later, Jake would look back on his London ice cream incident as the moment he truly grew up. The expensive lesson taught him that actions have consequences, respect is non-negotiable, and sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important learning experiences. He kept Sergeant Hayes's pin on his desk as a daily reminder that honor and dignity are worth protecting, even when nobody is watching.